What's up, gamers? Welcome back to 180 MTG. My name is Ryan Overturf, and today I'm going to be talking about one of my own personal cube designs, certainly something I'll be doing a lot of on this podcast. The specific cube I'll be discussing today is what I call Return to Midgar. It is a 180 card cube based on the game Final Fantasy VII, made possible by Magic's recent Final Fantasy set and the corresponding Final Fantasy VII Commander decks. This is the most aesthetically driven cube I've ever designed, and it's the closest I've come to designing what they refer to as a set cube, where you only use cards from one specific limited environment. This is pretty meaningfully distinct from one of those environments, both pulling from the aforementioned Commander deck and from releases across Magic history to fill in the gaps. The Final Fantasy set did cover all 16 main titles in the Final Fantasy franchise, so only so much of it was dedicated to Final Fantasy VII, so finding ways to round that out and make a fully functional 5-card design was pretty fun and engaging for me. So even if you're not into Final Fantasy VII, I do think there's going to be some stuff about the design that might be interesting to you if you're trying to do some kind of aesthetically focused design. I think something similar to this that I wrote about back in 2022 around when the Brothers War released. I wrote an article about designing a cube around the Brothers War, and I didn't take that prompt to mean design it around the set The Brothers War. I meant around the characters involved in the Brothers War, a cube about Urza versus Mishra and the feud between the two. And so that was a cube that tried to highlight those characters. In a very similar vein, this Final Fantasy VII cube, the Return to Midgar cube, really focuses on the characters in Final Fantasy VII, how to highlight them and to make these characters really shine. I'll have a link to that article about the Brothers War Cube in the show notes. I will also have a link to the Cube Cobra page for Return to Midgar. I'm going to be talking about a lot of cards today, and I'll do my best to say what the more significant cards do as I go along, but it will be a useful resource to have that visual aid to follow along with the cube list here as well. Now, before I really get into the design of the cube, I do want to talk about Final Fantasy VII just a little bit, because it's a game that holds a very significant place in my life. That's why I was so excited for this release. That's why I was so excited to work on this cube. If you're unfamiliar with the Final Fantasy franchise, each game tells a story with characters entirely independent from the other games in the series, so you can just pick up any Final Fantasy title and you should be able to just jump into that world. They're set up that way to kind of slowly introduce you. They don't really expect you to necessarily know anything before you start playing. And Final Fantasy VII was both the first Final Fantasy game to see commercial success in the United States, and it was the first Final Fantasy game that I ever played. In fact, I discovered it a few years before I started playing Magic. I was at a friend's birthday party when I was about 8 or 9 years old. He had a PlayStation, we didn't, we were a Nintendo household, and a small group of us were taking turns. I remember the point of the game that he was at was when you first leave Midgar, and you go past the Chocobo farm, and there's the giant swamp where there's this shadow of this huge snake called the Midgar Zolom. If you look at the Rootbound Craig from the Final Fantasy VII Commander decks, you'll see the Midgar Zolom depicted, or if you've ever seen the "Did Sephiroth do this?" meme, the Midgar Zolom is the creature reference in there. There's this tree that's standing and sharpened to a point with this giant snake impaled upon that tree. So that's the Midgar Zolom. And importantly for this story, in the game, it's an encounter that you actually never have to, and when you first get there, you're not supposed to ever actually fight. The Midgar Zolom has too much hit points, it does too much damage. It even has a move where it can remove one of your party members from combat, and when it does that, they're functionally dead in the combat. So if the Midgar Zolom removes one of your party members and does lethal damage to the other ones, you get the game over screen all the same. So you're just supposed to not fight it. You're supposed to find a clever way around it. So we didn't know this, we're kids, and so we're just taking turns getting our asses kicked and having the time of our lives, honestly. A very fond memory of mine. And a year or two later, Final Fantasy VII was re-released for the PC, which is when I picked up a copy and completely fell in love with the characters and the world. The protagonist, Cloud Strife, is this spiky-haired blonde boy who's very capable but very insecure. And he hides his insecurities under a veneer of trash talk and sarcasm, so needless to say, Cloud Strife is the most I have ever seen myself in a video game character. And importantly, as a protagonist, there are multiple times when Cloud just does the wrong thing. To an extent, he's being manipulated by the antagonist Sephiroth and Genova, and there's some corruption going on there. But the manipulation, importantly, wouldn't be possible if not for Cloud's own struggles with himself. Cloud, our hero, he does the wrong thing multiple times despite his best intentions. And there's something so profoundly human and relatable about that to me. That aspect of the story, the themes of grief as well, are really powerful and resonant with me. They were when I first encountered the game as a kid, and they still are meaningful to me as I learn more about the game and more about myself now today in my 30s. I could go on talking about Final Fantasy VII for hours, but I suppose I should get down to the cube as it is our topic for today. So let's get into the design of Return to Midgar, my 180 card Final Fantasy VII themed cube. I'm going to break the design down in Wooburg order like I used to do in my old cube articles, but first I want to go over some notes on the design broadly. This is a Final Fantasy VII themed cube, so I wanted to use as many of the cards with Final Fantasy VII art as was reasonably possible. I also went a little bit out of my way to feature every named character, every legendary creature that is from Final Fantasy VII is featured in this cube. Some of them are a little on the strong side. That's not really my concern. There's actually more going on the weak side. There's some pretty weak legendary characters that I did make a point to have a home for in the cube, because that's really what this cube is about. And kind of the other thing that drives that is that I didn't want to have much in the way of legendary or named characters from any other world featured in the cube. There are a couple exceptions. Kind of the big one is that I allow legendary chocobos from other Final Fantasy games, just because chocobos are a big part of Final Fantasy VII, and there's some cool bird synergies, so I pushed birds as a creature type that matters, which is kind of fun. I like that aspect a lot. And then another aspect of highlighting all of these named characters is that outside of the specific removal spells and sweepers with the Final Fantasy VII story moments and aesthetic, I did not really pull for removal spells or interaction outside of the Final Fantasy set or the Final Fantasy VII Commander deck. I really didn't want to go heavy on stuff like Fatal Push and Path to Exile. For the most part, I want you to cast these legendary creatures and attack with them, and figure out combat and navigate combat with characters from the world of Final Fantasy VII is mostly what this cube is about. White is one of the 3 colors in the Naya Final Fantasy VII Commander deck, so there's a good number of options for white cards that explicitly fit the theme. There are 23 total cards with Final Fantasy VII art in white. I feature 15 of them in the cube. Some of that is that a number of these cards are more commander focused. I really don't need sweepers like Vanquish the Horde in this environment. And there's also some creatures that are on the powerful end for not being a named creature. There is a Pure Steel Paladin in the commander deck, and I think that with how much I went in on job select in this cube, that is going to be more powerful than stuff like Cloud Midgar Mercenary in a lot of games, so I shied away from that kind of thing. But the more modest Hella Trooper has a really nice home in this cube. So I have a lot of named white legendary creatures. Like I said, I also go heavy on job select. Most of the equipment that have job select are featured in this cube, even though most of them have nothing to do specifically with Final Fantasy VII. That's more of a broad Final Fantasy thing. And just broad Final Fantasy tropes is actually something that I go pretty heavy on this cube as well, with cards like Battle Menu, that even though it's from a different Final Fantasy game, it does have the right aesthetic for the cube here. And then also going down white, you see some of the micro themes in the cube and some ways that I supported specific legendary creatures. For example, Aerith Gainsborough is a 3-mana 2/2 with lifelink that grows larger when you gain life. Technically, Aerith could do the work herself if you somehow are attacking and getting through and Aerith is surviving. She does grow herself, but you do want some other ways to gain life to make a card like that work. So a card that works with Aerith that also works into the bird theme that I have to support the chocobos is Healer's Hawk, kind of a cheeky little 1/1 flying lifelink bird. A role player that I like quite a lot in the cube. And then Restoration Magic is one of those tiered spells that gains life with the fully kicked mode. So there's a couple little ways to make that life gain work on Aerith. A card that I was a little bit on the fence about is Summon Knights of Round. I was a little on the fence because it does cost 8, but as somebody who has raised multiple golden chocobos in multiple decades, this is just too essential to the Final Fantasy VII experience. I couldn't not include it. And then in other colors, in green specifically, and a little bit in the colorless column, I have some support to make Summon Knights Around something you could realistically cast some of the time. And then there's removal spells like Dispatch. Dispatch does have the Final Fantasy VII treatment in the Commander deck. It's a little bit weak as a removal spell. Getting Metalcraft isn't free in this environment. There's nothing like artifact lands. There's not that much in the way of cheap artifacts. You're mostly getting there with these job select equipment. And that kind of modest removal, that's something I'm happy to have in this environment, because you do want to be able to interact at least on some level. Also want to shout out Job Select. If you're unfamiliar with this mechanic, it's kind of a twist on Living Weapon, where instead of a 0/0 germ, you make a 1/1 hero token, and you attach equipments with Job Select to that hero token when they enter the battlefield. A lot of the Job Select cards, they have pretty steep re-equip cards. If you take a look at some of the cards in the white column, Paladin's Arms, for example, you're mostly playing this as a 3-mana 3/2 with Vigilance, and then it reattaches for 4, which is pretty steep. You don't actually end up doing that too much, but then cards like Weapons Vendor can cheat that a little bit, and there's some other ways to move equipment around in the cube as well. And then I also want to highlight in the white column some of the cards that make this environment feel a little bit more like a set cube, a little bit more like you're playing at a retail limited power level. Cards like Summon Choco-Mog. This is one of the more charming summons from Final Fantasy VII, and this is a very modest card. This is quite a bit weaker than really any of the named legends in the cube. But it's a bird, so it plays with the bird synergies. There's some stuff to like about it. And again, this design is primarily aesthetically driven, so Choco-Mog gets a pass. The most suspicious looking spell in white is actually going to be Ultimate Magic Holy, which very much reads like a commander card. It's just a 3-mana sort of fog/protection spell. It can come up in a big way. I specifically really like the idea of using Ultimate Magic Holy to protect yourself from Ultimate Magic Meteor. It hasn't come up in any games that I've played yet, but I want to see it happen, and it's the kind of thing where Holy is such a fundamental aspect of Final Fantasy VII that I couldn't get myself to not feature the card in the cube. On balance, though, white was one of the easier colors to fill out in the cube. It even has the cube's only legendary 1-drop in the form of Zack Fair. I actually really love the design of Zack Fair. He's a very flavorful card. He has an on-the-board trick where you can sacrifice him, move his +1/+1 counter and the equipment on him to a different creature, and that creature gains indestructible to end a turn. So that's flavorfully evocative of the way that Zack protects Cloud in the game. And also, it's flavorful in kind of a secret way where I literally always forget how Zack works, and I've been blown out by the card multiple times, which is reminiscent to how Cloud forgot Zack ever existed in the game. So that's a fun Easter egg for me as well. And then there's cards like Ancestral Blade, pulling from the broader world of Magic, that just make a lot of sense aesthetically here. In Final Fantasy games, going through equipment, some very cool swords, some very mundane swords. This is the kind of thing you encounter a lot of in the game, so that's really at home here. I also really like that Ancestral Blade makes a soldier being a big aspect of the Final Fantasy VII game, and I have Soldier Military Program and Heidegger Shinra Executive in white that do care about Soldier as a creature type as well, so that's kind of a slam dunk for me. Moving on to blue. Blue is actually the color that has the fewest Final Fantasy VII skinned cards. There's actually only 4 total that are printed, and the card Ether, which is kind of a spells matter slow artifact, doesn't really fit my environment, so I do only have 3 of the 4 Final Fantasy VII specific cards in the cube. My favorite of those 3 cards is Eject, which does depict the Midgar Zalem using its ability to eject Aerith from combat. So that was something I talked about at the top of the show, really cool feature there. The other 2 are actually pretty weak. They're some of the earliest bosses in the game in the form of Valkyrie Aerial Unit and Scorpion Sentinel. Scorpion Sentinel, actually the first boss in Final Fantasy VII. And these cards, they don't do a ton, but they make sense here flavorfully. I was not going to exclude them, especially with there being so few Final Fantasy VII skinned cards in blue. And then they do add some artifact matter stuff. They're going to make cards like Dispatch a little bit more playable by existing. I also liked that they upped the artifact threshold by featuring some artifact creatures, which allowed me to include Glint Nest Crane, which is a bird that also cares about artifacts. And artifacts and birds are a lot of what I have going on here in blue. So just getting some volume on those themes was a good use of the color. And there's a couple more easy slots as well. Summon Shiva and summon Leviathan. These are not specifically from Final Fantasy VII, but I do really love these saga creature designs. Shiva is a home run. This Leviathan, the play patterns of it, the first chapter, it's a 6-drop for a 6/6 with Ward 2 that returns essentially every creature to its owner's hand except for itself. It doesn't return krakens, leviathans, merfolk, or octopus, or serpents, but there's not a lot of any of that going on in this cube. So I don't know that that's the most fun card. It's one that I was a little bit on the fence about, but it is good to have some swinging effects, especially when you consider that some of the named characters are quite powerful. So have something that you can do to come back from behind is useful in the environment for sure. I do, at this point, also think it's meaningful to call out that I have some changelings in the cube. In blue, I have Moth Dust Changeling, and I have Shapeshearer. Changeling is going to be significant for that summon Leviathan. These creatures won't be bounced. And then there are also birds for your bird deck. There's soldiers for your soldier synergies. And there's a couple other creature types shadowed out from various cards in the cube as well. So I do like that small sampling of changelings. There's a good amount of job select equipment in blue, and then I also used a lot of blue slots just for more birds. There's quite a lot of bird random encounters when it comes to monsters in the world of Final Fantasy VII, so just getting some random birds in here is satisfying. Cloudfin Raptor is cool. Card I'm always happy to cube with. Silver Raven is another card that's an artifact and a bird, so it can show up meaningfully in that way. Also, a 1-mana flyer is pretty good in an environment that has so much equipment, so the card's a little bit stronger than it maybe looks on face value. And then cards like Ledger Shredder and Mockingbird, these are just generally playable cards. Ledger Shredder maybe not as powerful as it usually is here, because you're not going to see anything like 1-mana cantrips in the environment. And I actually kind of like that, because again, I generally do want the named characters to be what really shines on the battlefield. So Ledger Shredder can be a good card, but it's kind of modest in an environment where more of your stuff costs 3 or more mana. So I've been pretty satisfied with that inclusion, even though it's one I was a little bit worried about on paper. A blue card that I considered is Keeper of the Nine Gales. If you're not familiar, it's a 3-mana bird from Legions, 1/2 flyer, has tap 2 untapped birds you control, return target permanent to its owner's hand. It's a pretty cool card, and if my goal was to just make the bird deck as good as possible, I would absolutely be featuring Keeper of the Nine Gales. But that's not my goal, right? My goal is to make the named characters, the aesthetic of the world of Final Fantasy VII, the important thing happening here. That's what I want on display. And if you think about the play patterns of Keeper of the Nine Gales, what is possible, the theoretical ceiling: Turn 1, Birds of Paradise. Turn 2, Keeper of the Nine Gales. Turn 3, Bird, tap all 3, bounce your land. And that is tremendously punishing. Without any kind of interaction, which again, this environment is a bit light on interaction to highlight those named characters, that's going to win almost every game where it shows up. And that is extreme. It involves specific cards, it involves having that turn 1 mana bird. Could also be Gilded Goose. But even if you step it back a little bit from that, and you don't have the turn 1 bird, you just have a turn 3 Keeper of the Nine Gales, you can still fairly reliably activate it on turn 4, and there's still just not that much removal in the cube. It's less likely you bounce your opponent's land every turn, but you do get to bounce a permanent every turn, and that's going to be really difficult to come back from. So this is a cool card. I liked the idea of cubing with it. It's just going to be a little too loud. It's not going to match the aesthetic super well that I'm going for. It just highlights the wrong things. So I do want to have support for the bird decks, but I don't want the bird decks to be the best thing going on, and that's why I did not include Keeper of the Nightingales. And then a card that maybe looks a little bit weird is the Reality Chip. This is one of my very few exceptions to allowing a legendary permanent that is not specifically from Final Fantasy VII exist in the cube. On its face, this is an artifact creature, it's an equipment, the reconfigurability, it does make sense in this environment, but there's something deeper going on here as well. This is a cheeky nod to something in that original release of Final Fantasy VII for the PC, where there's this room that the devs had working on the game called the debug room that you can get to by some means outside of just playing the game straight up, where you end up in this room where you can talk to NPCs and there's all these different characters in different poses saying weird things, and really this is how the devs would navigate the game. So you can teleport to really any stage of the game if you go through the debug room. It is a big part of speedruns of Final Fantasy VII. You go to the debug room as soon as you can, and then you find the way to transport to the final scene, so you've registered as beating the game. So that's how speedruns of the game can work. So the Reality Chip is a cheeky nod to the debug room, the place you can go that takes you anywhere. And I think that the Reality Chip's ability to play cards off the top of your deck, it's like cheating, you know what I mean? It really feels aesthetically right as a reference to the debug room. Maybe this one's just for me, but I like it a lot, and hopefully some other people can appreciate what I'm doing with that slot. One last blue card I want to talk about is Stolen Uniform. It's a 1-mana instant that gains control of an equipment until end of turn and attaches that equipment to one of your creatures. The skin for this card from the Final Fantasy set is from Final Fantasy VI, but both Final Fantasy VI and VII have this story moment where you steal a uniform to infiltrate kind of a military operation. In Final Fantasy VII, it's going to be stealing the Shinra uniforms to invade the Junon Harbor Parade, which is a pretty fun arc in the story. There's some cards in the commander decks that actually reference that. The Darksteel Plate, with the flavor text of Cloud saying he remembers the first time he put on a Shinra uniform, is what I wish that the art and the flavor text for this card was. So I'm calling this an honorary Final Fantasy VII card, and the way that Stolen Uniform plays is pretty powerful and fun in this environment. It can be a little punishing for those heavy re-equip cost job select cards, but then it also pushes back against some of the strongest equipment in the set as well, and it's a fun little combat trick. I like this one quite a lot in blue. Moving on to black, black being the other color not featured in the commander deck. There are 8 black cards with Final Fantasy VII art, and I do feature all 8 in the cube. That was not too difficult to make work. Black is going to be a little bit lighter on job select equipment, but there's a decent amount of them, and then there's some nice reconfigure cards here. I'm a huge fan of Blade of the Oni. This is just the kind of sword you would encounter in a role-playing game like this. Just a really cool cursed sword. Rounds out the curve as well as a 3/1 artifact creature for 2. And then I have some creatures here that are largely to support playing with Sephiroth Fabled Soldier. I didn't want to give a really easy, powerful sacrifice deck in the cube, just because I think that Sephiroth is one of the creatures in the cube with the highest ceiling, and it does only cost 3 mana. But I gave you some nice stuff, Wriggling Grub being a really nice creature to sacrifice with your Sephiroth and get a couple more bodies that way. Wriggling Grub also just being really believable as a random encounter in the world of Final Fantasy. Reno and Rude also being a sacrifice outlet as well, so some support there. Scrap Heap Scrounger being an artifact for the artifact synergies. I can play with those sacrifice themes, made sense to me as well. And then you do see some of the removal in the cube here in black. Sephiroth's Intervention being a slam dunk, both a story moment and making sure I get some removal in the cube. I also went with Overkill. It's from a different Final Fantasy game, but that -0, -9,999. Very evocative of the genre. Love that here. And then I also included Nameless Inversion. I did want some more typal synergies there, and it's just kind of a decent removal spell. +3, -3. It doesn't kill everything. There's a decent amount of 4 toughness stuff, so it's not just a Doom Blade that you always put in your deck. You're playing it for synergies in some capacity. And then also this is sometimes a pump spell. That +3 on the power there is meaningful. I also think Nameless Inversion really works aesthetically in the world of Final Fantasy VII, and I'm going to relate that to Changeling Outcast, which is featured partly for those typal synergies, but also because Changeling Outcast really reminds me of those Sephiroth clones, the men in the black robes just wandering around towards a reunion, infused with Genova cells, sort of going through an identity crisis in that way. So Changeling Outcast to me really feels like the men in the black robes, and Nameless Inversion really looks like the fate that befalls them. So I really like aesthetically how those cards fit into this world. Then you have a couple more of the most powerful cards in the cube in black, in Vincent Valentine, who is just an awesome creature, a little bit vulnerable in the form of a 4-mana 2/2, but because the environment is so removal light, it's a little bit easier to get off the ground with that sort of thing here than you can in a lot of cubes. And then one that I was, again, slightly hesitant on in the summon space, Summon Primal Odin. This is not the Odin from Final Fantasy VII, and just a ETB to destroy a creature, and then having that text where it can maybe win the game on its own, and then if it doesn't, the Chapter 3 draws 2 extra cards. There's a lot of power there in Summon Primal Odin, but it does work. Summoning is part of what's happening in Final Fantasy VII, and in actually playing with the cube, costing 6 is a lot of mana. Even though the mana curve is not as efficient as a lot of the other designs I work with in the 180 card space, it is still a big ask to get to 6 mana, so it's good to have just actually powerful effects once you do meet those mana thresholds. Next up is Red, another color featured in the Commander decks. There are 15 options for Final Fantasy VII skinned cards in Magic. 10 of them are present in the cube. The exclusions are going to be dumpier Commander cards like Chaos Warp that is just not particularly strong in a 2-player game. But then Red does give good options in the job select territory. I also really like including the card Chainsaw, which is another card that just works as a cool equipment to have in the RPG kind of world. And artifact creatures like Sarpadian Simulacrum, I really like that pull. It's a way to get a little bit more removal in the environment, but it is pretty inefficient to actually pull off. So again, this is the kind of thing that looks a little bit like retail limited efficiency. It's a tool that allows you to navigate games. Sometimes you do want to be able to destroy some of these named characters, but you do want to actually have to spend a real amount of mana to do it. There's also just some really nice removal spells in Red, Fire Magic and Thunder Magic being tiered spells that give you some interaction there. And Red also has a couple really serious sweepers that are story moments in the game, both Ultimate Magic Meteor from the Commander deck and a Nibelheim of Flame. Nibelheim of Flame is pretty brutal as a sweeper. It can really do a Plague Wind impression for only 4 mana, and then it has Flashback as well. That's going to be another one of the standout cards on power level. There's enough going on in the cube and big spells where I think you can come back from this kind of thing, but it is the sort of card that I would generally avoid in my 180 card designs. Once again, I'm taking a back seat with mechanics to aesthetics. This is a story beat that is so essential to Final Fantasy VII that I couldn't really exclude it, but it has led to some pretty one-sided games. That's just going to happen in an environment like this. There's also another 6-mana busted summon here in Summon Kujata, this one coming from the Commander deck, this one being a Final Fantasy VII version, so I wanted to make sure to include it. Even though Kujata is less prominent in the game than a lot of other summons, I think Odin is one that I've summoned a lot more in Final Fantasy VII than Kujata. But even still, it's on theme. 6 mana 7/5 with Trample and Haste is a huge deal. It does 3 damage to 2 things when it enters, so this card is scary powerful. But I have cast it and lost. It can and it does happen. There's a decent amount of higher toughness stuff going on in the cube. And again, 6 is a pretty high threshold of mana. Missing a land drop on the way there can be really detrimental. I have lost games where I've cast Kujata. There's just a lot of game before it comes down. There's ways to navigate around it, and it's played better than I thought. I was again hesitant with this big 6 mana bomb, but 6 mana is a lot, and it's played better than I anticipated. On the topic of 6 mana cards, I also made room for Random Encounter, which is a 6 mana sorcery where you shuffle your library, mill yourself for 4, and you put each creature card milled that way onto the battlefield and give them haste, and then you return them to your hand at the beginning of the end step. Random is exactly right. This card can sometimes win the game when you cast it, and it can sometimes do nothing. It also flashes back for 8. I think this is more fun than anything. I think this is a way that you can justify putting Knights of Round in your deck. It's just one slot, so I like embracing the chaos a little bit. It's a lot of random number generating that happens when you're playing a JRPG. This card doesn't really fit the kind of thing that I usually like to cube with. I don't love cards that sometimes do nothing, but there's a promise of something potentially sweet going on here, so I gave it a pass for this environment. Red also features Yuffie Materia Hunter, which is realistically one of the power outliers in the cube. The Ninjutsu ability is very efficient, but also just a 3-mana 3/3 that can steal an equipment in an environment that's so much about equipment. This is very flavorfully Yuffie, but this is a very strong card. It can be frustrating to play against, but in my experience, it's pretty fun to play. So I like featuring this Yuffie here. I think this is a really cool design. And then the funniest card in red is Avalanche of Sector 7. It's a 3-mana 0/3 with Menace. It has power equal to the number of artifacts your opponents control. And that means that you have no agency over the power, right? It's your opponent's artifacts. They should have some in this environment with so much job select going on, but sometimes Avalanche of Sector 7 does just have 0 power. And for that reason, this is not the kind of card that I would normally have in a cube. 3 mana, potentially just horrible body. But it's funny. It's a named character. I'm not shying away from that. I put in every named character. That's the aesthetic of the cube. And it can pick up strong equipment like Wrecking Ball Arm and do some work there. So being legendary does at least matter in some capacity. And then while we're talking about red 3-drops, there's a little bit of weirdness going on with Vincent Vengeful Atoner. 3-mana 3/3 Menace that grows stronger when you deal combat damage to your opponent. But then he has an ability that really only matters if you have multiple opponents. Generally, when I'm cubing, I'm playing 1v1, so that's kind of flavor text here. It can read a little bit weird, but I did want to make sure to get in as many named characters as I could. If I'm giving a pass to Avalanche of Sector 7, I'm definitely going to give one to Vincent Vengeful Atoner. And that brings us to green. Green has 16 Final Fantasy VII themed cards, and all 16 are present here in the cube. They made my job easy on this one. There's even a little bit going on with other chocobos from other games that help round this out. Traveling Chocobo being the big one from Final Fantasy VII. And then I give a pass to Saz's Chocobo. I don't have any idea who that character is, but it's another Chocobo friend, so that fits in here pretty well. Got a couple more cool summons. I think Summon Titan's quite a bit stronger than Summon Fat Chocobo, but Summon Fat Chocobo, much like Chocomog, is going to give a pass for being charming and being where the first summon you actually get in Final Fantasy VII is Chocomog. So you either get Chocomog or Fat Chocobo is when you use that. I couldn't not include that in the cube. Get a lot of Chocobos, and then you get some mana ramp here, Nature's Lore, Rampant Growth, Cultivate. These all show up in the Commander deck with the Final Fantasy VII theme to them, both giving you landfall for your Chocobos or enabling putting cards like Summon Knights of Round in your deck. So a lot is added from green there. A card that I didn't plan on putting on the cube at first, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized it had to be here, is the Harmonize from the Commander deck. Harmonize, a 4-mana draw 3, isn't the kind of thing you usually think about when you think about a creature-centered environment, an environment that's really trying to push a lot of named characters, but the story moment here is just too important. This copy of Harmonize depicts Aerith praying at the altar for Holy in her last moments, and it's just too essential of a story moment. Aerith's death is so fundamental to everything that is Final Fantasy VII. I could not include this card. Even more important, I think, than Ultimate Magic Holy is this depiction in the cube. A card that was really fun to break down flavorfully for me in green is Professor Hojo. So Hojo is a 2-mana 2/2, reads the first activated ability you activate during your turn. The target's a creature you control, costs 2 less to activate, and then whenever one or more creatures you control become the target of an activated ability, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. So naturally, this synergizes very well with equipment. This is from the Commander deck, so of course this is drawing you a card as you discount your equipment, kind of turn over turn is the idea of this card. And at first blush, I thought, that's really weird that Hojo plays so well with Cloud. Hojo's a villain. But then I thought about it more, and the character Hojo, he literally engineers Cloud to be what he is. He engineers Sephiroth to be what he is. So it just makes so much sense, and it's so flavorful and diabolic. The way that Hojo makes Clouds, like plays well with Cloud, is just really cool for me. So discovering that, it was really awesome. I love this design quite a lot. It's not where my mind would have went as a designer, so I really have to commend whoever had a hand in designing Professor Hojo. Chocobo Kick gives you some modest removal, a little bit of a fight spell there, so I like that. And then Chocobo Racetrack also gives you something aspirational. Another bit of Go Big that works well with kind of this larger package I would have in the cube to facilitate cards like Knights of Round. And then, of course, I have Birds of Paradise, one of the most iconic cube cards of all time, being a bird for bird type. It's kind of funny having Gilded Goose right next to it. Birds of Paradise is generally stronger than Gilded Goose, but there's some artifact matter stuff going on. You know, your Gilded Goose can power up your dispatch, can give you the metalcraft you need there. So it is not just stronger. Both of these cards do have some merit. Also worth noting, with all the equipment in the cube, just 1 mana flying creature, like I said with Silver Raven, these birds, they can get busy with some of the stronger equipment in the cube. Diamond Weapon is a card in the cube that I did not include in my first pass. It's a 9 mana 8/8, and it costs 1 less for each permanent card in your graveyard. So naturally, stuff like Fetch Lands, Mishra's Bauble, whatever, stuff that easily goes to your graveyard would be what facilitates this. This is not a cube that has Fetch Lands in the mana base. There's not a ton going on with Self Mill, but once you put in cards like Town Greeter, you get a little bit of mill there. Cards like Summon GF Ifrit gives you a loot effect there. So you can discount Diamond Weapon in some ways. This can come down early. It is a big spell. It plays pretty well with Summon Titan, can put some permanents in the graveyard. All of these enchantment sagas eventually put themselves in the graveyard as well, so there's a little bit of synergy there. This is also some of the justification for putting Shinra Reinforcements into black. 3 mana 2/3 that mills you for 3 and gains 3 life is not terribly strong in the environment, but it gains life for Aerith, puts cards in your graveyard for Diamond Weapon. So the pieces fit together in ways where you can kind of justify featuring and then playing these cards. Diamond Weapon also kind of nice to hit off of Random Encounter if that's the road you're going down. Random Encounter can also put some permanents into your graveyard to discount it. So there's not the most support for a card like this. It's not pushed anywhere near close to its extremes, but there's enough going on to make the card playable. And that's a lot of what this design is with this aesthetic focus, is just getting enough going on to get the game pieces that I want to look at, make them actually show up in decks, instead of what I usually do, which tends to involve really trying to get the most out of every individual card. Here, I'm largely just trying to allow every card to show up. When it comes to multicolor cards, I feature 11 of the 13 cards with Final Fantasy VII flavor. The 2 omissions are going to be Decimate from the Commander deck. It does depict a pretty significant story moment, the fall of the Sector 7 plate, but Decimate's not really a card that plays very well in 2-player games, much more at home in Commander. Certainly if you have more support for every card type, you're just almost never going to have an enchantment to destroy, and Decimate does require you target everything. And then I also issue Tifa Martial Artist. It's a Naya. It's a 4 mana 4/4, and it just has 2 abilities that really only work in multiplayer games, so similar to Decimate there, but then being 3 colors is even a bigger deal. 4 mana 4/4, I can abide. Like, I think Barret Wallace is playable in this cube just by virtue of being a 4 mana 4/4, but Barret's mono red, and then Tifa's Naya. It's really a lot harder to justify a Naya card, even though when we get to the lands, I do have more support specifically for Naya mana bases. That's not so that you can play 4/4s with no text. There's just plenty of other cards within Naya that you would play, and this card would never make a deck, even if it was castable. The gold column here is where it becomes readily apparent that I didn't try to color balance the cube. I do want similar representation on monocolor cards. I didn't want to just have Naya be the only thing going on, because there were blue and black cards I wanted to highlight. I wanted it to be realistic for you to play a blue and black deck, and also blue and black with any other combination of cards, but I wasn't going to strain myself to make sure that I had gold cards representing every color pair. More than anything, I just wanted to represent the aesthetic that I'm trying to portray here, and going out of my way to really fill in slots was only going to work against that. Sid Timeless Artificer is a little bit funny. It has a tax where a deck can have any number of copies. There's only one Sid in the cube. I have the Final Fantasy VII Sid. It gives artifact creatures and heroes you control +1/+1 for each artificer you control, and each artificer card in your graveyard. So this is another thing that can queue off changelings. There's actually a couple of the changeling synergies here in the gold column. There's also Genova Ancient Calamity that draws cards equal to the power of any mutant you control when it dies, so your changelings are inherently mutants. That's less important on Genova, but it does reinforce the aesthetics when I was talking about Changeling Outcast really feeling like the men in the black robe, and that being something that involves Genova's cells. The fact that they're already mutants, that really reinforces kind of the world that I'm presenting here in the cube, so I love that fact, even if that is not necessarily a significant aspect of how the cards really play together. And Barret Avalanche Leader is a 4-mana 4/4 rebel that snaps equipment onto rebels at the beginning of combat. So he gives you a 2/2 rebel whenever an equipment enters under your control, and then at the beginning of combat of your turn, you attach up to one target equipment you control to target rebel you control, so that can get your equipment attached for free. Just at a baseline, you can attach any equipment to Barret or the tokens that he makes, or all of your changelings will be rebels as well. You also see the last of the legendary permanents that aren't from Final Fantasy VII that I allowed in the cube here in the gold column in Choco, Seeker of Paradise. This is also significant for being a 3-color card. This is a Bant 3/5 legendary bird for 4 mana that has the Chocobo ability, which is landfall. It gives it +1/+0 on landfall. And also, whenever one or more birds you control attack, you look at that many cards from the top of your library, put one of them in your hand, and you can put any lands from among them on the battlefield tapped and the rest into your graveyard. So this is a huge bird payoff. I don't know what Choco is. I've never played. It looks like Final Fantasy IX is the one this one is from. Notably, it is on my to-do list. I am working on playing through the Pixel Remaster. I just finished Final Fantasy III this week, just started Final Fantasy IV. I'm gonna go up to 9. We'll see if I play past that. But anyway, I have not yet made myself familiar with Choco, but I do like this card for this environment. Kind of a fun, I'm going to call it an Easter egg in the cube, is an interaction that's kind of silly on its face, but actually plays really powerful, and is evocative of some weird stuff that can come up in RPGs that I actually really like, just kind of how this represents the genre, is Red 13 Proud Warrior. 3 mana 3/3 Vigilance Trample Gruul creature, gives your modified creatures Vigilance Trample and Haste, and when Red 13 enters, you return target aura or equipment card from your graveyard to your hand. So specifically, there's not a lot of auras and equipment that naturally go to your graveyard, but the one that's quite nice with Red 13 is Citizen's Crowbar. It's an equipment in white. You can sacrifice it to destroy an artifact or enchantment, so it's going to be an answer to your opponent's powerful equipment, and then the Red 13 can get it back when it enters. And it's funny because Red 13 is a 4-legged creature, could never actually use a crowbar, so that being a synergy, it's just kind of goofy that this weapon works with this character that could never really wield it. I find that very charming, and that is the kind of weird thing that does happen in these games. So I do like that a lot. It's also similar to Birds of Paradise picking up a sword, which is a thing that's literally happening in this cube, so playing into that a little bit, I do have a lot of fun with that. There's not a ton going on with Red 13 in the cube, but there is literally that synergy, and then it's another card that fits into those interactions with Diamond Weapon, the little bit of Seth Mill, the little bit of looting or rummaging in the cube. So there's stuff to do with it. And then there's just the stuff I couldn't get away from in this column. I'm going to have every Aerith card in the cube. I'm going to have every Cloud card, even the 3-color Cloud X Soldier. Certainly if I'm making that exception for Bant for Choco, I'm going to have Naya Cloud. The weakest card in gold is going to be Rufus Shinra, which is an Orzhov 2/4 for 3. And when Rufus attacks, if you don't control a creature named Darkstar, you create Darkstar, a legendary 2/2 white and black dog creature token. Tremendously modest rate on this card. It has a lot of toughness, but it's just not that strong. It is a card that you will put in decks. Actually, the last time I played this cube, my friend Evan just beat me up with an Orzhov deck, casting creatures with power and toughness. There was a lot of trash talk around him beating me up with Rufus, and it was pretty satisfying to see it in play. It's always nice when the stuff on the lower side of the power curve can hang. That does mean there's something really working in your design, even when the weaker cards can show up and be successful. And I want to talk about one card I didn't end up keeping in the cube, which is Terminate. Just the classic red-black destroy target creature for 2 mana at instant speed. With red and black having so much removal, kind of the bulk of the removal in the cube, naturally it's going to be in those colors anywhere. It's certainly true here. I thought that having a gold card that gave you a little bit more interactions, you had more outs to the most powerful creatures in the cube, might be good to have around. Oftentimes I don't put Terminate in my cubes for the reason that there's just better mono black removal these days, and I kind of liked the idea of it in this environment because you have to go into 2 colors to really get that kind of off aesthetic, just clean answer to something. Ultimately, I went against it, wanted to make some room for some more stuff and just use the slot somewhere else. But that did fit with kind of the theme of if I'm going to add more interaction, I would want to make you work a little bit harder for it, just to make sure that what I think is cool about the environment, what I'm trying to highlight, once again, that being the named legendary creatures, I want those things to shine, and using something like making you go into 2 colors for the most efficient removal would be a way to do it. I just didn't go all the way there. But it's some interesting food for thought. Alright, for colorless spells, there are 21 cards with a Final Fantasy VII art. Only 8 of the 21 cards are featured in the cube. A lot of that is going to be stuff for Commander, stuff like Soul Ring and Arcane Signets that are fully non-starters. I just went with the stuff that plays the best, the stuff that's the most on theme, and that's generally going to be the equipment. You have a lot of characters' ultimate weapons. You have Yuffie's Conformer Shuriken, which is actually really strong. If you have kind of an equipment theme in your cube, I like this equipment a lot. It allows you to tap a creature when you attack, and then it also grows your attacker if it's smaller than the thing that you tap. So there's a lot of utility on that card. I love the Sword of the Animist for the landfall theme with the chocobos, growing a little bit stronger with that. It also is another card that can get you up to Knights of Round mana. Wrecking Ball Arm and Buster Sword are also just really nice equipment. I was a little bit hesitant on Ultimate Weapon for costing 7, but it's at least strong when you get it going. I would be remiss if I didn't include Cloud's Ultimate Weapon. That's just going to make the cut, even though it's oftentimes not going to make decks. When it does make decks, it can get stuck in your hand, but it is cool enough that it's going to get a pass. The card that I would be more likely to cut is going to be the Masamune, which is not even strong when it's in play. It's pretty unfortunate. So the Masamune's a 3-mana equipment. As long as equipped creature's attacking, it has first strike and must be blocked if able. An equipped creature has, if a creature dying causes a triggered ability of this creature or an emblem you own to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. There's just not that much stuff that really cues off of this. It equips for 2, so you can force your opponent to block your first striker. That's okay, but that's a 5-mana investment to get there. This is naturally going to be the strongest if you can equip it to the mono black Sephiroth. It's going to work with the Wriggling Grub and maybe a little bit of other stuff I put in to support it. But realistically, the Masamune is just the weakest card in the cube. I wish it even just gave +1/+1. But this is Sephiroth's signature weapon. I don't have it in me to cut it. I think it's readily apparent how weak this card is, so it hasn't been the kind of thing where somebody puts it in their deck and is disappointed. Usually people read it and they think, oh, that card's not strong, I'm not going to play it. This is probably a good time to point out that I don't feature any of the Through the Ages reskins or cards from the Final Fantasy Secret Layer in this cube. That stuff is all just kind of a really high power level. It doesn't feel like the named characters and the world that I'm presenting are actually what matters. For example, there is a Umezawa's Jite that is reskinned as the Buster Sword, and if I put that in, we know that Umezawa's Jite is broken in environments where combat matters, and the games where that card is strong, it won't feel like the Buster Sword is strong. It'll be like another game ruined by Umezawa's Jite, right? There already is just a Buster Sword card, and it actually has a really cool ability, and it's fun to play with. So I want to highlight that version. I don't want to put Umezawa's Jite in a card where it's clearly too powerful. Especially with Cloud Strife just being a tutor for Jite, that's just way over the line. There's also an Atraxa that's reskinned to be Sephiroth, the 7-mana Atraxa that looks at your top 10 and can put a card of every permanent type into your hand. That's just not fun. That's not going to fit the bill here. It's just a strong card for the sake of being a strong card. It's going to push players more towards playing soupy decks. So that's not what we're going for here. I'm trying to stick to the new cards that were built to really highlight this world, not just powerful cards with new art slapped on them. I have World Map here, which could be nice for supporting decks of 3 or more colors, though I haven't really seen 4 or 5 color in this cube just yet. It's also just kind of nice both for being an artifact and for that landfall with the chocobos, Explorer's Scope with the goggles showing the high wind. That's another miss for me in this set. There's no high wind card, especially with the mono white Sid caring about vehicles, having that text to reduce the cost of vehicles. There's no vehicle in this cube. I do wish that there was a high wind. Alas, it's represented here on Explorer's Scope. And then there's Summon Bahamut. Bahamut is just one of the coolest summons in any Final Fantasy game. I'm a huge Bahamut fan. The art on this is from Final Fantasy X, but Bahamut is of course present in Final Fantasy VII. There's Bahamut, Neo Bahamut, and Bahamut Zero. I can't not have Bahamut. It does cost 9. It's going to be even harder to cast than Knights of Round, but all the stuff I'm doing to make Knights of Round castable is going to work for Bahamut. It's cool enough to try, but 9 is a lot of mana. It certainly has not been a problem in the cube, and the idea of controlling Bahamut is just really cool. Very happy having this card in the cube, even if I wish that it was something that was a little bit cheaper. A significant card in my colorless spread is Inspiring Statuary. It's actually probably the strongest individual card for the big spells decks for making cards like Knights of Round and Bahamut actually castable. I didn't have this card in my initial list because I don't consider a statue of President Shinra to be all that significant of a story beat, but when I was looking at making sure you can cast sometimes 8 or 9 mana spells, this was the card from the commander deck that is the best ramp source for those really expensive spells that doesn't just make it too easy to cast some of those 6 mana bombs, your Leviathan, your Odin, your Kujata. It is good for ramping into those, but a notable thing about this card that I also like is that it's a colorless rock. So it's a 3 mana artifact that gives all of your non-artifact spells improvise, so you can tap it or any other artifacts, typically your equipment or your artifact creatures, to cast your spells. But then most of these bombs, Knights of Round, Odin, Summon Leviathan, they have double pipped casting cost. So Inspiring Statuary makes it more possible to get to the mana thresholds for these cards without necessarily making it easier to cast. So it's not super easy to just put all of the strongest cards in the same deck. So I really like this as a tool to make those decks possible without making them too powerful. This was a really good find from the commander deck. And last but certainly not least, we have the lands. I generally just followed the cycles of lands in the commander deck. That's going to be Pain lands, Filter lands, and the 3 mana tapped lands, Jungle Shrine, representing Temple of the Ancients here, being your 3-color Naya land. So I just rounded those cycles out generally. Definitely had to have the full cycle of Pain lands, or at least a lot of Pain lands, after seeing this Battlefield Forge with Junon's cannon. It's just such a cool piece of art. It is kind of funny that there's reskinned copies of both Rugged Prairie and Firelit Thicket, but there's no Wooded Bastion in the commander deck. But anyway, there are more options for Naya lands than the other colors, so that's where I would have broke from these cycles. So any color pair not represented in the commander deck, you're going to see the Filter land, you're going to see the Pain land, and you're going to see all 10 of the Tri-lands in this cube. But we're talking about Celestia, Gruul, and Boros. I took some liberties. Boros, the least of which, you have Rugged Prairie, you have Battlefield Forge. I just added Clifftop Retreat, because it has that really cool Mount Nibelheim art, so I added that in. But then for both Selesnya and Gruul, I did change settings up a little bit. For Selesnya, you actually neither see the Pain Land nor the Filter Land. So those are lands that don't have reskins in the commander deck. I just went with the three that do: Canopy Vista, Sungrass Prairie, and most reluctantly, Fortified Village. I have made my hatred for the Snarl cycle pretty well known. These lands are a bit weak, but I justified it because you do at least have an additional green-white land. You're upping the volume in that way. This is literally the last card that I changed in the cube, though. I was sitting down to record, I was looking at the lands, and I was kind of amused that there's like 7 different Gruul options, and I whittled it down to 3, and I was just kind of thinking about how I wish that there was a Wooden Bastion. Now I had a green-white land that did not match the aesthetic of the cube, so I just cut the Wooded Bastion for the Fortified Village. That Fort Condor art, it is really cool. I just wish that we got the on-theme Wooded Bastion. The brush land in the commander decks is also themed after a different Final Fantasy game. So the green-white lands aren't the strongest, but green-white does get an extra land over the non-Naya color pairs, so there's at least some strength there. And then for Gruul, I went with the Firelit Thicket because it's on theme. I added Gungaga Reactor Town because I definitely wanted to represent the towns in the game. Gungaga being significant for being Zach's hometown, having a little bit of towns in the cube for cards like Reach the Horizon, for cards like Town Greeter. It's minor, but I do want to highlight that stuff a little bit for being themes in this set. And then there's that Rootbound Crag featuring the impaled Midgar Zalem. This one absolutely had to be in the cube. So I leave some number of the Gruul lands on the bench that do have Final Fantasy VII art. There's a really cool one with Rocket Town art, but there's ultimately just so much room. I don't want to have a million Gruul lands in the cube. Truthfully, if there was more Selesnya lands, I might even go up on that just to make Choco Seeker of Paradise more realistically castable, but keeping it to 3 Gruul lands does make sense with the spread I have here. And then there's just 4 lands at the bottom of the column here. You have Midgar, City of Mako, realistically just a mono black card. That one's nice just to have a land with a spell on it. Spire of Industry is a little bit weak, but it does depict the Shinra Tower. Really cool art there. It'll make some decks. There are colorless artifacts that can turn it on, so it is nice. The Gold Saucer, I think, is really weak, but it's another one of those things where it's like it's one slot. Once I'm adding this mana ramp stuff to try to get people to sometimes cast 8 and 9 mana cards, that means you start playing 18, maybe 19 land decks, so this card can show up in that way. And hey, it's really fun if you do flip the coin and make the treasures, and really, really fun if that treasure is what gets you up to Knights of Round. I do think Starting Town is kind of funny in this cube. I put it in for being from the Final Fantasy set, for having that Final Fantasy RPG aesthetic. But when it comes to Final Fantasy VII, your Starting Town is Midgar, right? That's already represented. So it doesn't exactly fit here. I might end up removing it from the cube. Haven't fully made up my mind. But it's just one of those cards that is a general Final Fantasy trope, and so I did put it into the cube. And that's going to do it for my breakdown of Return to Midgar, my Final Fantasy VII themed 180 card cube. If you're a fan of Final Fantasy VII, I'm definitely interested in your thoughts. Does this environment look like something you'd be interested in playing? Maybe you've tried it out and you have some feedback for me on the environment. If you have tried it, or if you plan to try it, I hope you like it. And I appreciate you taking the time to listen today. And if you're not a fan of Final Fantasy, then I really appreciate you taking the time to listen, because I feel like this is probably my most niche design. So I hope that there were some good insights for you on just generally approaching aesthetic design in Cube. Thanks again for listening, and if you have a moment, I would also appreciate you taking the time to like, comment, share, subscribe, and all that jazz. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll be back next week talking more Cube. Later, gamers.